Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Connor Moran. I am the director of the Wisconsin Book Festival. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for Nicholas Lamann's Transaction Man. We are joined by Nicholas Lemann and also joined by Brady Carlson from Wisconsin Public Radio. Hello to you both. Thank you for being here with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Connor. It's great to see you. Hi, everybody.
I also, just at the beginning, I want to take a moment to thank Madison Public Library, the Madison Public Library Foundation, and all of our sponsors for making this year's Wisconsin Book Festival possible. Their support and drive to have free cultural events for people here in Wisconsin, and now that we're virtual across the nation and across the globe, has been absolutely unwavering for 8 years truly, but really over the last 8 months. And so I really want to take a moment to thank them, and I hope that you do too. I also want to remind people that events like this are possible because Nick did an incredible amount of work, and he wrote a really great book, and we're going to buy it. So there is a link at the bottom of your screen to buy your copy of Transaction Man from our bookselling partners at A Room One's Own bookstore here in Madison, or please support whatever independent is near you and that you deeply care about. We have about 5 events coming up over the next 3 weeks. We will take Thanksgiving week off, but next week we have Claudia Rankin, we have the novelist Charles Yu, we have another one of our Wisconsin Wednesday partnerships with the program in creative writing, and then the first week of December we'll be hosting Danielle Evans for her new book, The Office of Historical Corrections, and Pulitzer Prize winner Jane Smiley for her latest book, Perestroika in Paris. So we hope to see you at future book festival events as well. And I will step away and let Brady and Nick take it away. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thanks so much, Connor, and glad to have everyone here with us. We're talking about a book that covers profound changes in our culture, in our society, the way we operate and the way we live. And we are certainly living through a period this year that that is full of profound changes. But these are changes in Transaction Man that play out over decades and generations. And it sometimes takes some unpacking to find out where we've been so that we understand where we are now. And who better to do that than Nicholas Lemann, the author of Transaction Man. First of all, it's so great to talk with you. I learned so much from this book. And as I mentioned, we've seen a lot of profound change, not just this year, but in the years and the decades and the generations before. One of those big changes is that we're seeing a big decline in the trust people have in institutions. And another is that we're seeing greater and greater concentration of wealth. Income inequality is on the rise. These are issues that we hear about, but what was it that convinced you to look back, to sort of trace where this all started and how we got to this point? What made you want to look at these models that you talk about in the book in greater detail?
I've lived through a lot of the changes that you were talking about um, in my own life and watched this all happen. And, almost every significant experience I've had in my life, I won't go into too much gory detail, has sort of been part of this story I'm telling. But, just for a couple, uh, inequality has been steadily rising since about 1980. That is, economic growth, when it happens, used to be more evenly distributed across incomes, and since then has been very highly misdistributed to the people at the very top. Um, the financial system has grown tremendously into a sort of controlling position in the economy. Um, and, the general feeling of the country has been, it went from a lot of faith in institutions, perhaps excessive faith, to tremendous disillusionment, to let's try free markets and fluidity instead of institutions. And now we're in a season of tremendous disillusionment with that. So I tried to ask myself, where did this world come from? And right now I can just feel that we're at an inflection point where the next version of America and the world is being invented or going to be invented before our eyes. So I'm trying to sort of set up for that phase.
So let's go back to what existed before, as you said, the model that became so clear in 1980. It's a model that, in contrast to Transaction Man, where you're talking about leveraged buyouts and the art of the deal and things like that, you had a model that you could sum up as the Organization Man.
Yeah.
What does that mean, and where does it come from?
So let me start with zigging in a different direction, then I'll zag back there. Everybody knows President Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again." Less sticky, but it's worth noting, President-elect Biden's slogan was "Build Back Better." Both of these slogans by, guys in their 70s, kind of have in them a notion of nostalgia, a sense that there was an America that used to exist that was better than the one we live in now. So this idea that somewhere back there things worked better, the society worked better, the economy worked better for everybody, is very powerful. So where that came from. In the early 20th century, there was the appearance of big concentrations of wealth and big industrial corporations. We take these for granted, but at the time, they were a new thing, and they were seen as representing a kind of crisis for American democracy. The country's political system and constitutional system were designed with an essentially agricultural country in mind. The big project was to have a government that could govern but wasn't too powerful. So suddenly you had the spectacle of private companies that weren't accountable to anybody being maybe more powerful than the central government. So that was the big debate through the early decades of the 20th century, was what do we do about these big corporations? During the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt, government grew tremendously. And, from one perspective, at least, corporations were tamed because they went from being freestanding, unaccountable organizations to essentially regulated organizations that government had a measure of control over. So after the Second World War, this book, The Organization Man, was published in 1958. It was by a great journalist, no longer with us, named William H. White, who was a writer for Fortune magazine. And it was about the post-New Deal world, where you had these big, stable corporations that seemed to sort of order and control national life, in combination with then big, powerful labor unions and big, powerful centralized government. So that was the kind of world as people saw it in the 50s. Now, some people liked it. We can get into who did and who didn't. Some people hated it. A lot of people who weren't white males in particular were completely excluded from it. But it was a kind of social order where, if you worked for a company like General Electric or General Motors or IBM, you had, the de facto guarantee of a lifetime job, and the company gave you health care and all these sort of community functions. And when you retired, you'd get a defined benefit pension. And that was kind of how people organized their lives. That world, which was the world for millions and millions of Americans, sort of blew up very dramatically in the 1980s and created this very different kind of economic and social world that we're in now, and political.
It's interesting because a century ago, we were coming out of the progressive era, where the rhetoric at least suggested that bigger was not better, and the big unaccountable organization should be broken up. That's where we
Well, yeah, but I want to stop you there, because actually this is one of the interesting things that came up in the research for this book. the position you're describing, which is, by the way, we can talk about this later if you want, very much coming back right now today, the idea of breaking up big economic concentrations. Um, that position was one liberal position associated mainly with Louis Brandeis, later a Supreme Court justice. But there was a battle royal within the liberal camp between that camp and the camp that was anti-antitrust, that wanted businesses to become bigger. And one of the main characters in my book is a fascinating guy named Adolf Berle, who was one of FDR's main advisors. And he was way in the other camp, although he thought of himself as the ultimate liberal. So it's important that this fight took place within the house of Roosevelt and in the progressive era. So Berle, his first job was working for Brandeis and Brandeis's law firm. And he spent all these years sparring with Brandeis. Then in the 50s, the organization man era that we were talking about, Brandeis was dead. Berle wrote a book in which he said, well, Justice Brandeis is dead. I have his picture on my desk, and we disagreed during his lifetime. But now I believe he would have changed his mind, and he would agree with me that breaking up big businesses is silly, and we've got this wonderful world where big businesses are getting bigger and bigger and more concentrated. And the reason Berle thought that, and had this sort of after-death conversion of Brandeis, which I think was a fantasy, is he felt you need a target for government to shoot at. So if you have these very big businesses, if you have 50, 25 big corporations, you can really get your arms around them and make them behave themselves. Whereas if you have a bunch of smaller businesses, they wouldn't be as easy for the central government to control. So Berle, again, one of the most prominent liberals in the country, spent 50 years opposing every antitrust law. So it sounds like a footnote. It's not a footnote. It's an important fight that took place that we've forgotten.
And one of the outgrowths that you describe of that system that Berle saw coming to fruition and largely did come to fruition for decades was, I mean, you had huge companies, you had the automakers and other very, very large, wealthy, powerful, and often popular companies. But then you also had this interconnected web of companies that were connected to them. In the case of the automakers, it was dealerships or parts manufacturers or the unions that negotiated with them. And so, since you mentioned accountability before, in a way, it created a kind of, I don't know if constitutional order is the right word, or at least some level of accountability where you had great size and scale, but you also had local connections, the local dealership, the local bank that worked with people buying the cars, and that connection at that level to a neighborhood or a town.
So if somebody like Adolf Berle, who, familiar pattern, he started his life as an angry young man and ended his life as a self-satisfied old man. But he looked at the world you described, and he described it, very well. And after the Second World War in the 50s, and said, "This is it, folks. We've created a paradise." And he believed first that this was a very good society. And remember, for his generation, they had lived through the challenge of World War II and the Depression, real fears that the United States would become a communist country or a fascist country. So, you can't blame him for feeling we came through this with a wonderful system. And his big mistake was, you can argue that he made a mistake in thinking this is a sort of paradise. That's another subject. But his really inarguable mistake was, this is a social order that will live forever. He deeply believed that. And so did most sort of thinkers about the political economy at the time. And boy, did they have a surprise in store.
But before we get to that big surprise, I also wanted to note there's a parallel as you describe the community of Chicago Lawn.
Mhm.
in my native state of Illinois. Um, and not only do you have this order where you have the local dealership that's connected to the big automaker and you have the local bank, you have outside of economics, you have local elected officials and local religious leaders, locally owned banks. So if there is an issue that you have, there's a problem that you're trying to solve, it doesn't mean that you're always going to get what you want, but at least there's some person you can call to try to right that wrong or solve that problem, a real live person. And I think we all have had that experience now where we don't even know who we can even get in touch with if we have such a problem today.
Right. So a couple points about this. So Chicago Lawn is, I describe all these larger events, of policymakers and, big institutions. And then the book keeps doing a reality check in Chicago Lawn, which some people listening may know is a kind of blue collar, even working poor neighborhood on the southwest side of Chicago, very near Midway Airport. It's always been kind of the first stop out of for a renter in a poor neighborhood. The first house they own is going to be Chicago Lawn. It's been inhabited by a series of ethnic groups. So, and it's had interesting ups and downs over the years. It's now a half African American, half Latino neighborhood. It was an all-white neighborhood, but it's important when you describe these local institutions not to think this is a purely self-contained local community with community-based institutions. The local institutions are part of a larger matrix. And the larger matrix, as you said, has these sort of local outposts, but they're outposts of something bigger. I think when people talk about this issue, over they fall in love with the idea that communities are self-contained, but they're not. So, in Chicago Lawn in the old days, and somewhat now, I would say there'd be sort of three pillars, almost like medieval times, except with one addition. So there was the church, the Catholic Church, the state, the Chicago machine, and then the new entrant, the big corporations, big industrial organizations. The biggest plant, for instance, in Chicago Lawn, biggest employer was Nabisco. They made Oreos there. And there was a big Sears Roebuck store, but all of these things were local. People could go in, they'd see people they knew, but they were connected to this larger institutional system. And all these systems interacted with each other. There wasn't, business apart from government. It was much more of everything was sort of working together in a system. It was not always working well, but it was a sort of social system that was all encompassing.
And then, and I'll just read the line from the book, everything seemed calmed and settled, and then boom, it wasn't. So what and who was behind this push to say this model is not all that somebody like Burley would think it
Yeah.
was, and we need to do something very different?
Well, a lot of people didn't like it, including, sort of liberal thinkers at the time. William White, author of The Organization Man, the whole point of The Organization Man was what a hellish, nightmarish world of this community. It was a community called Park Forest, Illinois, not that far from Chicago Lawn, but one couple steps up the ladder, where these guys would go to their secure jobs and they'd come home and they'd be home at 5 o'clock every day. And he complained bitterly that there were too many organizations in community organizations in Park Forest, that there was too much little league and all that kind of thing. It was like a upside down version of the bowling alone argument that came later. So White was not alone. Many thinkers at the time thought this is just horrible, not for sort of economic reasons, but because it was corroding the American soul with conformity. So there weren't a lot of people, on the left ready to defend this world. You know, if you look, there's this famous Port Huron statement that the 60s radical group SDS wrote in 1962. It's filled with, you know, we live in a corporate state, it's terrible, etc. But my argument in the book is the real enemy of this state was an economic enemy more associated with conservatism, which I know sounds counterintuitive, but just to explain. So Adolf Berle's big theory in life was that corporate shareholders had no power. And he was, you know, substantially right. Corporate management could do whatever it wanted because shareholders were widely dispersed. And so they were the, you know, officially owners of the company, but they didn't actually control the company. So Berle, as a young man, said, this is the first time in the history of the world that ownership and control have been separated. And that was why he thought government had to step in and control the corporation because the shareholders did not. So Chicago school economists came along in the 60s and 70s and 80s and said, essentially, Berle was right, but the answer to the problem is to empower the shareholders and disempower government. You know, same problem of corporate unaccountability, but that the shareholder had to be put in the driver's seat. And this happened through a variety of mechanisms, including deregulating the financial system that had been super heavily regulated since the New Deal days, with Berle and others being the designers of that. And then also changes in the way the financial system worked so that shareholders became more powerful than corporate managers. So all this stuff you see now about, you know, corporate managers have to live their whole lives to produce, you know, quarterly earnings statements to satisfy the markets and all that. That started in the 70s and 80s, and it started intentionally. So all these techniques like leverage buyouts, private equity, mergers and acquisitions, paying CEOs in stock options, all those kinds of things were done consciously to bring together ownership and control and put the corporation in the hands of the shareholder. And once you did that, all these social functions had been loaded onto corporations by the government. And when corporations started being run solely for shareholders, those functions got stripped out. So you started to see relentlessly over time a loss of unionization, job security, pensions, healthcare, all those things, because they weren't, they couldn't be argued to be for the direct benefit of shareholders. So that left a real gap where you had a sort of accidental, in some ways, social order built around big institutions. And then the big institutions lost their ability to be social institutions, and things became much more sort of fluid and marketized and disconnected. And that created, in my view, a lot of the discontents that are powering not only American politics, but the politics of the whole world right now. We're just starting to rethink all this.
And from the perspective of a big company, I mean, what is the advantage of the old way, the Berle model, and then sort of what do they gain that they would have under the new model that they wouldn't have had before, when the government rather than the shareholders was sort of driving what they could and couldn't do?
Well, in the old model, I think, you know, corporations are big, complicated institutions that have to answer to lots of different people. If you're in the new model where you're answering to your shareholders, what you might like would be if you're at the very top of the company, CEO level, you would make a whole lot more money than under the old order. So this system was structured so that CEOs and top executives were very, very, very highly rewarded for serving the interest of their shareholders. So that was an advantage. I think it pretty much disadvantaged everybody below that level because this new system led to lots of layoffs and job reductions and moving jobs offshore and things you're familiar with. In the old system, I think what people got was stability. Um, for people who like stability. Uh, you know, the organization man was meant as a critique, but a lot of people liked being organization man, and those kinds of jobs were in demand. So it was trading a world where rewards were more limited, but there was much more social and economic stability for a world where there was much more freedom and fluidity, uh, but the rewards were much less equitably distributed, and that's a familiar picture to anybody who's watched the United States in the last 2 or 3 decades.
What we've been describing in a lot of ways is really just focused on the United States, but at the time that we're seeing this shift, we're also seeing foreign competition in a way that we hadn't really before. And I'm just curious how much of that you think is part of this story. Is it inevitable that the US is going to change the way that corporations operate when you start to see Japanese auto manufacturers, for example?
I don't think so. I mean, first of all, if you're trained in the discipline of history, they teach you, day one, never say anything's inevitable, right? Everything could always come out differently from the way it came out, and there, at every moment in history there are choices. So it's true that corporate America, prodded by government, could afford to take on all these burdens, these sort of social burdens or obligations in the couple of decades after the Second World War, because the rest of the world was flat on its back. So it didn't have global competition. On the other hand, if you look at Japan and Germany, specifically the big competitors, former enemies in the Second World War that arose to compete with the American companies, they themselves had and still have very different social orders and customs around their big, very successful companies. So, if you work for BMW or Toyota, you didn't go through this incredible disruption that you went through if you worked for General Motors in the last quarter of the 20th century. So countries and their government systems have choices to make on how they structure, their economy, their system of welfare benefits, how they govern corporations, and they make very different choices. And the U.S. made choices out at the edge of, free market, beyond, in my view, what was necessary to compete with these other countries who weren't doing that.
One of the arguments that the free market economists were making as all this was playing out is that, in a way, you don't really need the government to come in and do all of this regulation, because the markets can do the regulation instead, and the markets would be better at it anyway. Um, is that was that realistic, the way that they described how the big corporations would work, that markets would rein them in if there were excesses?
Well, the classic example to me of failed deregulation is the deregulation of the financial system. I wouldn't say auto companies, for example, were deregulated exactly, because they were regulated mostly for things like plant safety, pollution standards, um, and things that we haven't taken away. The financial system is a dramatic example of an industry that was unregulated, became extremely heavily regulated at the outset of the New Deal, stayed that way for 4 decades, and then was extremely unregulated. And the argument that you're describing was made throughout that process. A famous person who made the argument, to his regret, was Alan Greenspan, repeatedly when he was chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. And he would say, companies are like organisms. They have a life incentive to stay alive. So no financial company would ever put itself at so much risk that it could fail, because that would be imprudent. So they can self-regulate. Well, then you get to 2008, and basically most or all of the big financial companies did fail. That was a dramatic disproof of the theory. Derivatives in particular, things like, mortgage-backed securities, all those things that blew up in 2008, were sold at the time as risk reduction devices when they turned out to be risk enhancing devices.
And to bring Chicago lawn back into this, I mean, you have very, very profound effects of the housing crisis and the financial crash there on the people in Chicago lawn. Like so many communities, you see houses that that lenders from who knows where were offering mortgages that people probably couldn't afford. And since no one quite knew who owned those mortgages, people walked away from the houses, and that had really profound effects on the community. And
It was terrible, and they're, the now Chicago line is suffering terribly again because of the coronavirus. And you're just seeing the beginnings of the evictions and foreclosures. But in 2008, huge swaths of that neighborhood got foreclosed. It was really striking. And as you say, what happened was, in a nutshell, the home mortgages in the old days before deregulation were owned by local savings and loan company. And then in deregulation, which was again thought to be a good idea, the savings and loan companies disappeared. And what you had instead were these mortgage brokers who were very, very aggressive, and they'd go to, pretty unsophisticated people, convince them to take a lot of debt on, value houses at unrealistic levels. And then as soon as they had made the mortgage, they'd sell it upstream. And then it would be bundled with other mortgages and sold in the mortgage-backed security market. So, when the crash happened, community organizations were surprised to find out that large parts of the neighborhood were owned by Deutsche Bank and people like that. They didn't even know who to protest to or how to get to them. So that neighborhood was, a lot of conservatives said after the financial crisis, it was easy credit pushed by liberals that caused the financial crisis. I think there's some truth to that, but it's a 1-2 punch of deregulation, which conservatives pushed for relentlessly, and an easy flow of credit just created a storm that the neighborhood has never fully recovered from.
And it is interesting to see how hard they work to push back on this when they see what's happening to their neighborhood.
Right, the
There's
neighborhood
quite a number of people
organized.
who really work hard, and they say, no, we need to get a member of Congress on the phone. We need to get in front of the president or a senator or somebody
Right.
who can actually help us deal with this. We aren't going to simply just let our neighborhood fall apart.
Yeah, and they did a heroic job. And I should also say that, maybe it's just the bad luck of the draw, but when the neighborhood was white was when this old institutional system prevailed. The neighborhood then changed from white to minority, Black, Latino, and that's when this whole system started falling apart. So people of color had to really bear the brunt of these changes. I wouldn't say it was like intentionally aimed at them because they were people of color, but that's how the cards fell on the table.
I have a few more questions for you before we open it up to our audience for their questions and their comments. You also describe the development of a kind of network man, so to speak. And you
Right.
describe Reid Hoffman of LinkedIn and a number of other projects, which is kind of fitting because that's sort of how this model is developing, that you're connected not only to the people that are really close to you, but those weak ties as they're described. And the more you can get people engaged in that level, you can create a whole new network of people, of institutions, of startups, as he likes to see them. So what is the thinking there, and how different is it really from what's come before?
Yeah, well, that's the question. So, I mean, in the book has a number of settings. So Chicago lawn is one setting, Wall Street is one setting, Washington is one setting, and another setting is Silicon Valley. So Reid Hoffman is kind of the unofficial mayor of Silicon Valley, I would say. He's in his, I guess, now mid-50s. So he's of the generation that were young and came along and sort of started the first social network companies. He was, first came the personal computer revolution, then came the internet revolution, then came the social network revolution, which his group. He I think he was one of the first people to write a check for Facebook to be founded, for example. And he sort of operates in the inner circles of Silicon Valley. And he was very nice to let me sort of spend a lot of time with him and watch him in action. He started LinkedIn and then a couple years ago sold it to Microsoft. So now he's on the board of Microsoft. So, I mean, what's interesting about this world is it it's a social vision of its own. And the people who believe in it, like Reid Hoffman, really believe in it. And but as I'm saying this, keep in mind, this is another one of these issues like antitrust. In fact, it is antitrust, where what had been seen as a beautiful social vision is now intensely controversial and is sort of teed up as one of the big political battles of the 2020s globally. So the idea was, the old organization man world fell apart. It was replaced by the what I call transaction man world. That's now shown itself to have profound flaws. So rather than go back to the old system, we'll create a new system that lives on the internet, where you create these kind of instant virtual, very large communities, social networks, and they'll provide the kind of social glue that got taken apart in the financial revolution. Um, and they, provide the chance in the view of people who like this vision for everybody to be an entrepreneur and so on. So this is the vision where, you'd be much better off as an Uber driver than you would have been as a traditional medallion taxi driver, let's say. Um, so, but what's happened is, this is, I mean, there's lots of good things about this world. If you have teenage children, as I do, there's a lot of annoying things about this world too. Um, but it's, I don't think, well, one thing that's happened is it's created tremendous concentrations of wealth and power. So you have these big five tech companies, um, most in Silicon Valley. Microsoft and Amazon are in Seattle. They're the five most valuable companies in the United States. And for all their talk about their social commitments, they really have walked away from the old social compact around unions, pensions, and secure employment and all that. So, the stripping out of that part of the social compact didn't change. And, tremendous amount of wealth was created, but it was, concentrated at the top. And uh, these companies have, people now feel, disproportionate power. So there's a big conversation about breaking them up and regulating them. I mean, that's going to be one of the big events of the next 10 years. So this is kind of like, in the old days when you go to the movie theater and they had the film on the reels and you'd say, oh, this is where I came in, you know? because this is a lot like the moment in the 1920s when a lot of agitation was starting about big unaccountable corporations.
And something that we seem to see in each of these models that you write about is that there are ardent believers that, we have something really special here. This is a model that's really going to pay off big, no pun intended. But then there are consequences. And in the case of the era we're in now, you see companies now starting to recognize, they've become so big now that misinformation on social media can play a role in elections.
Right,
There's
exactly. I
concern
mean, when
that Facebook groups can be driving genocides in other parts of the world. Those
right,
are things that people who said, well, Facebook is going to democratize the world, it's clearly not always playing out that way. Or even just to talk about entertainment, we heard 15 years ago, YouTube is going to give everybody a chance to be a star. And yet the big players on YouTube are giant entertainment companies
right.
in many.
And when Facebook started, I mean, if you remember those days, it was just supposed to be a way to connect to your friends and family and just have a wonderful social life. And people, if you'd said to people, it wasn't that long ago, that if you said to people, these companies will, be at least accused of controlling speech worldwide, controlling politics, controlling economic opportunity, people would have said, you're nuts. I mean, to me, it shows that Brandeis and his buddies were right. And you, I think we should be very skeptical of taking a big idea that seems super attractive and making it the ruling principle for the whole world or this whole country.
And I have one more question that I'll ask you, as I hope that those watching who have questions will start typing them in and sending them to Connor. Uh, we said at the beginning, we're in a year of profound change, and one of the effects that we've seen of the COVID-19 pandemic is that some of the biggest billionaires have become wealthier just because of the nature of what they do, the services they provide, and how people have ended up needing those. And in other cases, for other reasons. We're also in the midst of a presidential transition. So given that, you've had the book out now for a while, what have you been thinking about in this year, given everything that's happening? And has it made you ask new questions about the topics that you cover in Transaction Man?
Well, yeah. So what I want to, the big finding in my head is that I could see happening in, we haven't talked about all the characters in the book, but Adolf Berle was very politically active, very close to FDR and other politicians. Reid Hoffman was and is very politically active, and in particular was very close to President Obama when he was in office. I think these economic changes, the big sort of story since about 2010 has been these large economic changes took place that reordered the global economy in very dramatic ways. And then they moved into the political space. So when histories are written in 50 years or 100 years, I predict you'll see, as in the transition from the late 19th century to early 20th, first comes a big economic revolution that's very disruptive. And then comes a series of political reactions that wind up with a new political order. We're not at the new political order yet. So, all over the world, on the right and the left, you see these populist revolts. I mean, the shorthand version in the US is Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. If I said to you on January 1st, 2015, 5 short years ago, let me tell you the two politicians who are going to change American politics, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, you'd say, come on, you're joking. And there have been versions of this all over Europe and much of the rest of the world. So you get this big sort of wave of dissatisfaction that doesn't sit inside one political party. And now everything's teed up and sort of ready to go. As I mentioned, both presidential candidates ran in large part on this idea that America sort of used to work for most people and it doesn't anymore. What are we going to do about it? With wildly different visions of what to do about it. Um, One of the most important things that's happening right now, I think, is that it has been for way over 100 years. Basically, it was the case that the Republican Party was the party of business and the Democratic Party was the party of labor. Um, the situation has gotten much more complicated very recently. And, you know, we have two closely matched parties that I could see competing. I mean, this would be in some ways a positive vision of what could happen for sort of middle class, working class voters. You know, this, in political reporter circles, which I'm in, this got a lot of pickup. Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri, who's thought to be getting ready to run for president, tweeted on election night, "We, the Republicans, are now the working class party in America." Well, it sounds sort of crazy, but you know, his point is uh, 44, I mean, I'm not saying exactly what he said, 44 of the 50 richest congressional districts in America are represented by Democrats. All 10 of the 10 richest are represented by Democrats. And so as part of this whole series of changes I've been writing about in the US, the Democrats have become, you know, Silicon Valley is Democratic territory. Wall Street is pretty much Democratic territory. Certainly in a Biden-Trump election, it was. Um, the prosperous cities on the coasts are Democratic territory. So there's this idea of, you know, prosperous, educated, big business America has moved to the Democratic Party from its former Republican home. And the Republicans now think they can use that to steal the old New Deal voters and make them Republican voters. So this political competition and policy competition is going to be, I think, you know, a big event in this decade we've just entered. That's been, I feel that much more strongly than 1 year ago when the book was published.
Here's a question that we got from the audience. It says, regarding financial deregulation, what was the rationale for getting rid of the Glass-Steagall Act? And do we need another act similar to it that separates commercial and investment banking?
Well, so the shorthand would be yes, or just a more regulated system. And there's a lot of sort of proposals going around about that. The rationale was, you know, this was done by Bill Clinton when he was president. And, you know, just about everything that happened in financial deregulation, the press release always had the words outdated New Deal X, you know. So the feeling was the Glass-Steagall Act was a relic. It was passed in 1933, 34. It was a relic of the early days of the New Deal, the depths of the Great Depression. It was passed in this 1990s view, sort of for emotional reasons to get back at Wall Street. But it didn't, it had outlived its usefulness in a modern, high-tech, globalized economy. You know, the particular thing that was, and you know, the person who really pushed this through was a big banker named Sandy Weil, who has since said, I regret, you know, pushing through the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act. The biggest problem with repealing the Glass-Steagall Act, as we found out in the financial crisis, is the investment banking side was not regulated. The regular commercial banking side was regulated. So if you took away the distinction, it permitted big financial organizations to sort of move a lot of activity out of the regulated realm into the unregulated realm, and that is what crashed. So there's problem of concentration that we talked about before. You know, the five biggest financial institutions in the US control more of the system than they ever have in American history. And then there's the problem of deregulation leading to risk and instability. Um, so, some version of this, whether it's the 1934 version or not, uh, it came partially back with Dodd-Frank, which corrected a lot of the problem. But I think you'll see another wave. And if you look at, who's advising Joe Biden, you on these kinds of issues, you see people who strongly believe that more regulation is needed.
We have another question here. It says, when you speak of conservatives viewing the financial crises being caused by liberals, are you referring to liberal politicians creating new policies or liberal Wall Street investors? Can you clarify?
Liberal
I'm sure
politicians.
I have concerns that we are headed in that direction again.
Okay, so that's a really interesting question because of how things are changing. Um, so the answer post-financial crisis, right after 2008, would have been liberal politicians. You'd see this, frequently on the Wall Street Journal editorial and op-ed pages. The idea that, liberal measures like the Community Reinvestment Act and others were meant to increase home ownership by, people without a lot of money. And this led to a lot of bad housing debt. So in those days, they were blaming liberal politicians. Now, somebody like Josh Hawley would blame the liberals on Wall Street, which even 10 years ago would have sounded crazy, but maybe sounds less crazy now. So that liberals are rich bankers who want to deregulate everything. When I was a kid, that described conservative Republicans, but now, at least in elements of the Republican Party, it's being trotted out as a description of liberal Democrats. So that's why I think it's the politics of this is going to be really interesting, because you would see the two parties sort of competing in policy terms here.
We've got one more question, and I'm just going to paraphrase for time. They're saying, what is the changing role for workers in these shifting paradigms? They talked about how in Madison, there was the relatively recent closure of the Oscar Mayer plant, the Janesville lost its GM plant.
Right.
We're talking about politicians, as you mentioned, both President-elect Biden and President Trump have talked about returning to this era where you'd have these kinds of jobs, good paying jobs that you could count on for a career if you wanted to. But we're also seeing people talk today about flexibility and adaptability. Maybe you need to change careers 4 or 5 times in the course of your life. How do workers cope with that?
So, the mantra of at least, Clinton era Democrats was kind of what you just said. It was lifelong learning. You shouldn't try to stop all these economic disruptions. Instead, you should just assume they're going to happen and educate people more and train them to adapt to very different economic conditions, have 3, 4, 5, 6 careers, be entrepreneurs, move geographically, etc. I think you've seen, not just in the US, but globally, a really big backlash against that view. Turns out that's not what most people want. And, how much you can abate that remains to be seen. But that position is not the popular position now. The more popular position now, in contrast to the last 20, 25 years, is government needs to find a way to let people live in stable communities and have stable employment to the extent that it can, without sort of putting crippling restrictions on the economy. In particular, free trade in sort of elite circles in both parties. If you spoke out against free trade, you were considered nuts. People would say, you want to bring back the Great Depression? You couldn't get tenure in a fancy economic department if you were skeptical about free trade. Well, now in politics, neither party is willing to say we're 100% for free trade. So the the political energy has really moved on that question.
Well, I know I have learned so much from your book and from talking with you tonight. And I just first want to say thank you so much, Nicholas Lemann, for sharing some of what you've learned in the process of putting this book together. And I also want to say thanks to everyone who submitted questions and joined us tonight. We sure got a lot to think about, don't we?
Yes, we do. And as I say, these issues that I'm sort of, I mean, what I like to do as a writer is what I would call history ending in the present, or sort of how we got here books. So I'm trying to sort of help people tee up a discussion. Main thing I want to say is, I've already said it, but I'll say it again. We're just starting to see all these big issues come front and center in politics. And I strongly predict you'll keep seeing that throughout this decade, these big arguments about, political economy and what government's role should be in making a good society where people are prospering. That's front and center right now.
It's Nicholas Lemann, the author of Transaction Man, here at the Wisconsin Book Festival. Thanks so much to everyone for joining us tonight for the discussion. And Connor, I don't know about you, but I've sure had a ball. This has been so great.
I'm glad to hear that, Brady. Me too. Nicholas, thank you so much for both your work on this book and for your presentation tonight. Brady, thank you for your thoughtful questions, and thank you to everyone watching at home. It was a delightful way to spend an hour, and I hope that you all felt the same way. As I mentioned earlier, you can join us on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday night of next week for more Wisconsin Book Festival events. You can check wisconsinbookfestival.org for all of those. We look forward to seeing you at an event in the future. Please click the green button below your video and buy a copy of Nick's book. Holidays are coming up. People need to know about these things, so I'm sure we can think of multiple ways to get your book out there in the world. And also, please click the link to our survey in the chat. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. We look forward to seeing you again. Thanks so much.